First, a brief overview of who I am. As a park ranger in the woods of the Pacific Northwest, I've spent my whole adult life working. I worked for the Park Service for over 15 years, with approximately 7 of those years spent at Olympic National Park. There are plenty of experiences that could be described as scary, but this one has stayed with me the whole time. My duties as a restoration carpenter for the Park Service were multifaceted. It was our mission to restore and repair to their original, historically accurate conditions, various outposts, emergency shelters, cabins, and homesteads in the backcountry. It was an amazing and challenging job. Typically, I would immerse myself in the backcountry for 8 days straight, away from civilization. We used the same tools and techniques that the original homesteaders used in the late 1800s to build and survive in this harsh environment, including flying in supplies and using llamas or mules to carry our gear. We slept in single tents with thin walls and cooked over fires or whisper-light stoves. An old homestead off the trail, close to the newly built boardwalk near Lake Gazette, was where I was supposed to be working one late fall. For those who aren't familiar, Lake Gazette measures 8 miles in length and 3 miles in width. As far as Washington state lakes go, this one is the biggest and most untouched. Native American culture has a deep and storied past in Lake Gazette. A mudslide over 300 years ago preserved most of the artifacts intact from a nearby village, and the Maka Tribal Center in Nia Bay houses artifacts discovered in the area dating back 2,000 years. There is a 9.4-mile section of the Gazette Loop Trail that runs alongside the homestead. Traveling approximately 2.5 miles from the trailhead, the man-made boardwalk passes under massive cedar groves and winds its way through expansive patches of chest-high salal. Eventually, it arrives at Ostrom's Prairie. 2 Swedish immigrants used to farm Ostrom's Prairie, a huge marshy meadow. On the 150-acre bog, they built a little cabin and some outbuildings using Swedish ingenuity, vegetable gardens, sheep, and cattle. For more than half a century, they carved out lives for themselves in this place. The forest eventually decided to reclaim its former territory, as it always does. After being deserted for decades, the farm looked completely different. It was our duty to clear the way for the new stove, paint the inside, replace the windows in the main cabin, patch up the partially decayed barn, and beat back the encroaching forest. The end goal was to make it possible for guided tours to happen at a later date. While we were working at Holstrom's, we stayed at the Azep bunkhouse for approximately 3 weeks. We did our duty well. We were able to avoid sleeping in the rain because our beds were warm, the hike was brief, and the terrain was easy. Not only that, but we had television as well. The ranger station and highway were close to the bunkhouse. Each day, we would lug along our boards, tools, paint, and anything else we might need as we hiked the 5-mile loop. Every day lasted 10 hours. At about 7 hod in the morning, we would begin our hike for the day, and at about 17 hod in the evening, we would begin our hike back to the bunkhouse. We went from having 4 people working on this project in the fall to having just 2 people left by the time this event happened. The bulk of the labor had already been completed. Before we could declare the woodshed partially finished, we had to hike a couple of boards less into the prairie. As the day's designated pack mule, my sole responsibility was to haul as many boards as I could manage on each journey to the prairie before making my way back to the ranger station to fetch more. We were lucky to see 2 or 3 hikers a day doing the loop. It was late in the hiking season. The weather had turned, and there were no more. When I was on my 4th or 5th journey, I was completely exhausted. By the time my coworker had finished for the day, it was well into the evening at about 16 hour. I reasoned that if I could squeeze in one more trip before nightfall, I would have less work to do tomorrow, since I had already done so much today. We continued on our way along the trail. I informed him of my plans and went on. I finished off the day's board deliveries. He surveyed the prairie as the sun dipped below the horizon, and I set out on my hour-long trek back to the ranger station. At this point, the cedars were blocking most of the fading sunlight, so the boardwalk's lighting was dim and visibility was poor. I have solo hiked for weeks in the backcountry without getting scared, so I am not a scared hiker. Cougars have stalked me, Alaskan Kodiak bears have confronted me, and I've even encountered some insane hillbillies. That night, as I departed from the prairie, a chill ran down my spine, a shiver went up my arms, and a sense of unease washed over me. My desire to walk, jog, and sprint intensified all of a sudden. Not me. I lied to myself and said I'd been reading too many fantasy books in the hours leading up to nightfall. I continued walking for another 5 minutes or so, until I began to detect a faint sound, almost like music. Unthinkable, I reassured myself. I'm the only one out here, and still at least 2 miles from civilization. My co-worker and that civilization are probably the only other sentient beings in the universe. But I did in fact hear music, a piano in particular. The first few times I tried to hear it, I had to pause what I was doing because the sound of the wooden boardwalk was too loud. It became increasingly clear and audible with each interval that I stopped to listen. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood there alone with the piano. As if everything were being engulfed in a fog of emptiness, I suddenly became aware that the sounds of nature had vanished, leaving only the piano to fill the air. No birdsong, insects, wind, rustling of leaves, or underbrush could be heard. This dead time in the woods is nothing new to me. I've encountered it in other places, but this felt special, like it belonged here and right now. I attempted to concentrate on the piano, but I couldn't place the arrangement. Not surprising given that Metallica and Korn were my primary musical influences at the time. The playing was deliberate. It was under control, melodic and contemplative. It was a song, and for some reason, I felt like it was written specifically for me right now. Just as I resumed walking, the music cranked up the volume again. Even as I sped up, the tempo of the keys remained steady and unwavering. My fear, my heart rate, my urgency, and the speed of the music all came together to create a crescendo. In the blink of an eye, the piano ceased playing and disappeared. It hadn't faded or trailed off. It had simply vanished. As if carried away by a sudden gust of wind, all that had been missing vanished. All the darkness, stagnation, and stillness had vanished, and the burden of everything had been lifted. As I stepped forward on the boardwalk, I was back in the real world. Even though there was still no light in the evening, something had brought the forest to life again. The forest looked the same. When I got to the bunkhouse that night, I didn't divulge every detail to my coworker, and I didn't hear the piano again. He exhibited no indications of doubt. Years later, when another Park Service employee had a similar experience, we brought it up again. I told my grandfather what had happened, and he asked me without hesitation, "Did you hear the bagpipes along with it, or just the piano?" This was because he was a retired park ranger who had worked nearby at Mora, the station across the street. Based on what I've seen and heard since then, it appears that the Olympics and that location are more complex than anyone is letting on. Tez and I embarked on the Great American Road Trip a few years ago. Our 6-week cross-country road trip was going to begin in New York and end in Los Angeles. We were both in our early 20s and severely strapped for cash when I proposed that, because my mom had worked as a long-haul trucker, we spend the night in the hatchback. It was an excellent arrangement. We made curtains out of one of the blankets and sheets we purchased at Goodwill. By the time the first week came to a close, we had mastered the art of setting up camp in under 10 minutes. This included everything from bringing the bags to the front to putting up the curtains and bedding. Any place that seemed safe and somewhat legal, parking lots, free campsites, rest areas, was where we slept. We had grown accustomed to our routine by the time we reached Arizona near Flagstaff in the final week of our trip. We no longer felt scared on any night after the first. With just a handful of must-see landmarks as our intended itinerary, we rarely adhered to a strict schedule and seldom drove more than 3 or 4 hours in a day. Our route was based on Google Maps searches made the night before, with input from fellow campers, residents, and strangers. Making friends was another skill we had mastered. I got hungry and overheard some rednecks saying they were going to Denny's, so we rode shotgun in their pickup truck to the restaurant. In a country bar, we befriended an 80-year-old cowboy who showed us the ropes and gave us a lesson in the lion dance. I hope Grandpa Mac is doing well. During a thunderstorm, we jammed out on guitar with a group of musicians, ate breakfast and dinner, provided by other campers who wanted to hang out, celebrated the 4th of July with a family who welcomed us into their campsite like family, and Grandma even gave us some weed candy. Nearly every interaction we had with complete strangers was pleasant. It appeared like this night would be no exception. We used Google to locate a free campsite, and then we followed our GPS into the woods. We had gotten quite far from town, and something didn't seem quite right. There was a single recreational vehicle parked at the campsite, and 2 cars were positioned higher in the trees when we arrived. A guy answered the door as we drew up next to their recreational vehicle. When Tess waved hello, he did nothing but stare blankly back. After that, he proceeded to slowly close the door once more while maintaining eye contact with us, as if nothing had been said. Assuming he merely desired solitude and considered us to be intrusive, we proceeded down the road until we discovered a level area to leave the vehicle. We smoked, laughed, and took embarrassing photos of ourselves instead of our normal practice of setting up camp as soon as it was light out. We decided to go befriend the campfire that Jess had pointed out further down the campsite. We strolled over to the campfire because we had met so many interesting people in the past 5 weeks simply by offering beer or simply chatting. As we had seen before, the car's owners were 2 men. We sat down and struck up a conversation because they appeared welcoming. While they smoked and drank, we sat down and shared a beer. A suspicious vibe emanated from one of the men, and it was later revealed that they were actually strangers. Because he was talking about extraterrestrial beings and going in circles, the elderly man was clearly under the influence of drugs, but he didn't appear to be dangerous. We ended up striking up a conversation with the younger man, who introduced himself as a retired park ranger. He was charming and laid back, and we talked for hours about our travels, our families, and anything else that came up. After that, he began to describe the bear he had seen, an earlier forest encounter with a bear. Seeing that Des didn't believe him, he took out his camera to show her the bear's photos. Even though it was close to the campground, we were both a bit frightened. We were terrified of a bear because getting up in the middle of the night to use the restroom was something that happened frequently. A dramatic shift occurred in the ranger's expression as he merely chuckled. It's difficult to put your finger on, but his voice had an icy quality to it. He pointed out, "If you get out of your car in the middle of the night, it's not a bear you should be worried about." It must have been on the foreigner and the city girl because I couldn't help but wait for him to poke fun at us, or at least nudge us with his elbow. That was never his case. In an attempt to hide my awkward laughter, I cracked a joke about forest serial killers. A companion of mine shared my amusement and made light of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. We shifted gears to discuss something else, but the ranger quickly returned to the original topic and began describing an ominous figure that had abducted us from our vehicle in the dead of night. He insisted on bringing up serial killers whenever we attempted to change the subject. By now, the elderly man had soared to dizzying heights and he was motionless, staring at the stars. We sipped our beers and laughed awkwardly, attempting to redirect the conversation. Afterwards, the ranger got to his feet and made his way to the cooler in search of an additional beer. I can only see the ring of light from the campfire in this now completely blackout world. Beyond that ring was where you could find the beer cooler. From out of nowhere, a red dot appears in the blackness. It took me a second to figure out that it's a camera. We were photographed by the ranger, who was holding a camera. As far as I could tell, the digital camera's green light was on, because we were nice people, and because my friend Tez is stunning. With dark hair and blue eyes like a young Megan Fox, it wasn't strange for the people we met to want to be in our photos. Having this stranger snap a picture of us without our knowledge or consent wasn't totally out of the ordinary. At this point, we were both staring at him like deer in the headlights. However, instead of recognizing that his actions are a bit strange, he checks his camera, makes some adjustments, and takes another photo, this time with the flash, without requesting that we smile, suggesting that we pose as a group or offering any kind of explanation. Without mentioning the photo at all, he returns to the fire and settles down after this. We are both absolutely terrified right now. We come up with a weak justification about how we have to go set up our campsite and then freak out. As we get up to depart, the UFO man adds, "Have a good night." "Be careful out there," the ranger warns as he gives us a smile that falls short of his eyes. "In the woods, you won't find just bears." A shiver went down my spine. It turns out I wasn't the only one who felt uneasy. Tez yanks me away from the fire and leads me to our vehicle. We hastily return to the vehicle, which we discovered in the dark by consulting the RV, and hop into the front seats. My pal Tez is about to pass out. Why did he take pictures of us? I trembled. I say, "I read that serial killers sometimes photograph their victims." After locking the car doors, she gave me a brief look. "Do you think he just took victim photos of us?" No one was more alarmed than us. In a state of complete panic, she activates the car's headlights. Since he now knows precisely where we left our car, I had to yell at her to disable them. For some reason, that was the only night we hadn't camped. Since there was no need to dismantle anything, we simply shifted into drive and accelerated out of the campsite. We crossed into a dirt road and saw the ranger approaching our vehicle with the same expressionless face. "Ranger, let's not meet ever again." Last week, I went to Yellowstone National Park and opted to rent a boat to go out on Yellowstone Lake. We aimed to have a memorable last day of our trip yesterday. Some Wisconsin fishermen were reeling in trout, gutting them, and reintroducing them to the lake as we lowered our boat onto the launch pad. To manage the fisheries, this is a government job, an incentive program for anglers. By conversing with and observing these men as they worked rhythmically, as they likely had for many years, one could discern their level of experience and expertise regarding the lakes. These guys are pros, basically. We were graciously assisted in bringing our boat in by a couple of the larger, older men. We have never used this boat before. The men advise us to exercise caution due to the increasing wind speed and the large swells in the water. Sad news. 2 park rangers and an angler were involved in a conversation that my dad overheard regarding a body that has never been recovered from the lake. Within 20 minutes, the fisherman says hypothermia had set in because the water was too chilly. We disregard his warnings and go out regardless. We were pushed back in by 3 5-foot waves, so we didn't get very far. We were aided in guiding the boat back into the dock and onto the boat trailer by the angler, who seemed to be anticipating our brief return. Simple words like, "I'm glad you're back," were all he needed to smile and respond. The weather outside is terrible. I thought it was important to set the scene so you could understand my fascination with the bodies that have been found in Yellowstone Lake, including those of park rangers and individuals who have gone missing. I have been unable to locate any details regarding the whereabouts of these missing rangers and individuals. After consulting the National Park website and asking around amongst park staff, I came up empty-handed. Do you have any opinions? I was wondering if anyone had any information regarding the 2006 or 2007 nighttime disappearance of park rangers and visitors to Yellowstone Lake. I presumed I spotted a distant campfire and proceeded to investigate it. There were conservation efforts underway, so it was forbidden to set up camps here. When I went over, I saw nobody and wondered, what kind of moron would risk starting a fire in an unattended location? I decided to go over there. From what I can recall, there were approximately 2 tents and nobody was around. I requested a couple of men to come and clean up by radioing in. I immediately began scanning the area for any indication of human presence as they pulled up. After scanning the area for a few minutes, I came up empty-handed. After putting out the fire and making sure everything was clean, we all departed. Because we had unattended equipment, we had 1 man remain there. I returned to the office thereafter. My break was overdue. Upon returning from my break, I noticed a trio that appeared to be in a bit of a state of distress. I went up to them and inquired as to their whereabouts in this forest. They informed me that they were camping but had been ordered to vacate the area immediately. Since there were no rangers on duty, my suspicions were aroused. When I questioned them about the person they saw, they claimed he was faceless and dressed in extremely retro garb. I felt a chill run down my spine when this happened. They complied with my instruction and went to retrieve their gear. I then witnessed their departure. My only contact with this matter is a 2006 park employee friend of mine. So far, he has not received any reports regarding this matter. Among my horrific tales, this ranks high. Even though I have no idea what transpired, the thought of hearing that in the midst of the woods at night sent chills down my spine.